The funny thing about the networking space is no school or college teaches networking. And it's one of the unwritten rules of life and of business is that having relationships with people is going to make a huge difference. But you don't get taught that. Progress in school or college is about getting a grade, a score, a mark, a metric. Then you get into the real world of work. And there's a whole series of things that count but can't be counted. Empathy, determination, grit, resilience, attitude, humor, crack. All of these things matter a lot. And they got everything to do with the person around you. Whereas in school, it's got nothing to do with the person sitting beside you.
That was Kingsley Aikins, diaspora and networking thought leader. And I'm John Lee.
And I'm Martin Nutty. Welcome to another episode of Irish Stew, the podcast for the global Irish nation.
This episode is sponsored by Shantala, your all-in-one business launchpad in the United States. Committed to excellence and execution, Shantala helps enterprises enter or expand in the U.S. market through bespoke project management and strategic planning solutions. Create and realize your vision with Shantala, where they invest their passion in your future success. To learn more, go to shantala.space. Yes, .space. It's a thing.
Hey, everybody, this is Martin Nutty, and welcome to another episode of Irish Stew. I'm joined in our studio by my mellifluous, keep working on that word, co-host, John Lee. Welcome, John.
Hey, thank you, Martin. I better get in good voice pretty quickly to live up to that. Looking forward to a great conversation today. And as I've learned about our guest, I realized he was a real trailblazer for us on Irish Stew, and we didn't even know it. It was his pioneer work, of course, with other people who really started to unleash the potential of what we've been calling the global Irish nation. He's a Trinity College graduate in economics and politics for 18 years, the worldwide CEO of the American Ireland Fund and its global counterpart, the International Ireland Funds. Especially for us, important here, he's a thought leader in the intertwined worlds of networking and diaspora engagement. I'm sure we'll uncover some more sterling credentials in our conversation with the CEO of the Networking Institute and an exemplar of global Ireland, Kingsley Aikins. Welcome, Kingsley.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
You know, we're going to talk about your career. We're going to get into some of the great work you're doing right now. But let's find out a little bit more about Kingsley Aikins, his story, his life. And let's start off with a thought-starting question here in the beginning. Your Trinity College classmate and two-time Irish Stew guest, Ted Smith, told us you were quite a rugby player. What did you learn on the rugby pitch that you've carried along in your work in networking and diaspora?
You know, I didn't know it at the time, John and Martin, but actually rugby became, for me, a global passport. Now, I played at school, I played at university. I was, like all youngsters that age, all I wanted to do was play rugby for Ireland. I actually, frankly, wasn't good enough. But I did play for Leinster, which is the province of Leinster. And then I got a chance to play for a season in France. So after college, I went there. I actually got injured after about 4 or 5 months, hobbled on, but actually it really terminated my rugby playing career. So I was 21, 22 at the time, and I had to give up. But all through my life, I've had an interest in it. And all through my life, I suppose you could say I've used rugby. And I worked for probably the most famous Irish rugby player in history, a guy called Tony O'Reilly, who, you know, was well known for his work as head of Heinz and Waterford Crystal and various other things. And of course, the founder of the Ireland Funds. But prior to that, he was the greatest rugby player in the world during his time. We're talking about the 1955 Lions tour to South Africa, 59 to New Zealand. He really was incredible. But I noticed how he used rugby as a passport around the world. It opened doors. Now, there were doors in traditionally more Anglo-Saxon countries, so you're talking about Australia, New Zealand, South Africa. But a thing I noticed about him, and actually I've never heard anybody say this, is that he invested, the only countries he invested in the world were countries that played rugby. So he invested in Australia. He bought newspapers in Australia. He invested in New Zealand. He invested big time in South Africa, became a major newspaper owner there. But he didn't actually invest in the US or he invested in England, bought a newspaper there. So those were the sorts of things that and so he used the connections that he made. And then having gotten to know him, and I got to know him through a rugby connection, this sort of serendipitous events happened, and I ended up working with him for 21 years.
Well, let's go back a bit before that, Kingsley. Where are you from and who are your people?
Oh, yeah, I'm a Dub. But the definition of a real Dubliner is somebody who doesn't go home for Christmas. Most Dubliners, hightail out of town to go back home to Kerry, Cork, Mayo, Donegal, wherever it is. So my parents my mum's from Sligo, my dad's from Meath. My mum was an Irish teacher. She went to Irish college. She did her degree through Irish Coláiste Bovee, and she became an Irish teacher. She taught in Kenmare and she taught in Achill Island. But actually she got fired. Do you know why she got fired? She got fired because she got married. And that was the way things were in those days. She lost her job because she got married. And then there were four of us. And my dad started work very, very young, and worked for a company from about age 15 to the age 77, the one company. Whatever number of years that is, it's a huge amount of time in one company. I often say, those days have gone. That escalator model of a career where you join, work, and commute, that's all gone. And that was a small pharmaceutical importing company. They had certain brands from out of Europe. They sold to chemists, and everybody in Ireland knew him. He used to go around as a traveling salesman to all the chemists and all the villages and towns. And that was my upbringing. I went to a small school in Dublin, school actually where, interestingly enough, W.B. Yeats went to. And he referred to the school once because we had a centenary of his birth. We had a big celebration. And some student found that Yeats had said about the school, he said, "My schooling interrupted my education," which kind of put us on the back foot as a school. But it was still it was a fine institution, still there today. And then I went to college, and then I, as I said, headed off to France for rugby.
So Kingsley, tell me a little bit about your first name.
Yeah,
I've only encountered it, I think, in folks out of the Caribbean. So it's unusual, I think, for an Irishman.
It's very unusual for an Irishman. In fact, I only know one other person who's a young fella who was actually, a friend of mine had a son, and he took my name and called his son Kingsley. But I tell you, in Nigeria and Ghana, it's quite common. It's quite a common name. And this is bizarre, but there's a guy called Kingsley Aikins, exactly the same surname, and he's a photographer in Ghana. Now, I've never been to Ghana, but if I ever do go to Ghana, I tell you, there's one shot I'm going to take after two KAs together. But, like always happens, Martin, and you're from Dublin, I was never called Kingsley. I was called Kinger. And to this day, I'm called Kinger. So, Kingsley to me is a foreign name. My name's Kinger.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So did your parents come up with the name? Was it a film they saw, or where did it come from? Any ideas?
So my mum had a pal, had some friends who had a child called Kingsley, and that was where she basically said, "Look, next one out is going to be Kingsley." My brother's David, my sister's Carol, my sister Jennifer, all sort of meat and two potato names, and then for some reason I got dumped with this one.
So you're a South Sider, unlike me. I'm on the North side of the world. Tell us a little bit about that divide, how it played out in your growing up.
Well, I suppose the thing is that we weren't that mobile. We had bicycles, but we had one Morris Minor car, which my dad drove into work every day and drove home again. In fact, here's a bizarre thing: he used to drive home for lunch every day. Can you imagine that? Those days, what you did. And buses used to have two people on them. There was a driver and a conductor. So it was all fairly, Dublin was a small provincial town. You look at Dublin now, it's an incredibly cosmopolitan place. I saw some stats the other day that something like over 25% of the working age population of Dublin aren't even born in Ireland. So it's an incredibly cosmopolitan spot. But it wasn't back then in those days. In fact, I told a joke the other night. I said we weren't a very kind of cosmopolitan eating restaurants, etc. And I was in a restaurant back then, and I asked the waiter, what's the soup du jour? And he said, hang on, I'll ask the chef. So he goes in and he asks the chef, and he comes out and he says, it's soup of the day, right? So we weren't that sophisticated, but boy, have things changed.
Kingsley, let's get you out of Dublin. I'm sure I don't know every stop along the way of your professional career, but a big chapter had to be with what became Enterprise Ireland. I think at the time it had a different name, but essentially you were representing the interests of Irish business abroad, and I believe Australia and New Zealand was where you found yourself for several years.
Yeah, I did a postgrad degree or a qualification in export marketing in the UK, and I then applied to what was called Chorus Structala, which was the Irish Trade Board, the Export Board. I joined them and I worked in Dublin for 2 years, but I just couldn't wait to get out. I mean, I just wanted to get away. I'm a big fan of the old line that says, who knows Ireland, who only Ireland knows. So if you really want to know a place, you kind of got to go away. And I was really keen on going to Australia. I had this kind of image and view of Australia. And it was quite funny because, you can't say and tell where you want to go. You just got to accept what the interview panel come up with. And there was 5 cities up for grabs on the day I was put my name forward. And they were Moscow, Sydney, Glasgow, Lagos, and then the glamour posting, Limerick, right? So my name came up opposite Sydney. So I said, basically, guys, when your country calls, somebody's got to do the dirty work, and I'm off. And I went out there and I spent nearly 8 years there, and I represented IDA and Enterprise Ireland. Absolutely loved the whole thing, mainly because I arrived, I didn't know a single person. I didn't know a sinner in Australia, and I met a lot of sinners since, but I didn't know a sinner when I arrived. And I just had to start with a blank sheet to start off. And it was quite funny what happened, because my mum had a neighbor who had a kid there. It's always the same. She gave me the number, and I rang him and I said, I don't know anybody. Can we meet for coffee? So we met for coffee. And I said, can you introduce me to the local Irish business network in Australia? And he said, there isn't one here in Sydney. And I said, well, why don't we set one up? So we got 13 people to show up for dinner one night. And we called it the Lansdowne Road Club, because I played rugby, he played rugby, so Lansdowne Road Club. As it grew, and in a spirit of sporting ecumenism, we dropped the word road and we just called it the Lansdowne Club. And it's there today. It's the biggest Irish business network in any city in the world. There's thousands of members. And it was set up to help people who were coming to the country, who didn't really know anybody, who wanted to get going, whether it be buying a car, finding accommodation, finding a job, finding a pub, whatever. And it just, the thing grew and grew and grew and became an amazing sort of network. And I was trying to find somebody who would be a great name to head it up. And the big name back in those days, we're talking about quite some time ago now, the big name internationally from Ireland was the name I mentioned earlier, was Tony O'Reilly, head of the H.J. Heinz Food Company in Pittsburgh, fabulous kind of person and name. I wrote him a letter and I said, would you be willing to head up this organization? You don't have to do anything. And I was amazed. I got a reply. That really was shocking. And the reply said 3 things. He said, 1, I'm really keen on setting up networks of Irish people around the world. I think there's a really interesting concept there that we could maybe work on. Secondly, he said, I'm coming to Sydney, I'm buying newspapers. And thirdly, I couldn't believe this. He said, would you be free for lunch? So I was going to write back and say, nah, I'm busy, sorry, maybe next time. But I actually said, I'd love to meet you for lunch. I met him for lunch and I worked for him for 21 years. So I'm a big fan of a thing, I call it funnels of serendipity, how luck and chance and randomness can change your life, but they don't happen lying in bed or sitting at your desk. They happen when you're out and about, when you do stuff, when you go that extra mile, when you put your talents on display, all of that kind of stuff. And that was quite a good example of it. I mean, I just writing a letter, it completely changed my life. And one of the things I teach on my networking is that one introduction, one conversation can change your life. But you got to kind of help create those things.
So you just kind of casually dropped into that lovely anecdote, networking, how you arrived in Australia, met somebody and said, we need to set up a network. At what point did it register in your life that networking was really important?
I think it was Australia, Martin, because I genuinely knew not a single person in the Southern Hemisphere. when I arrived. And I absolutely just knew that I had to go not 50% of the way, but 51% of the way. I had to kind of go a little bit outside my comfort zone, try and get into a growth zone, if you like. And it was that kind of a realization over a period of time, starting from there, of a few kind of facts of life about life and business in general, is that, firstly, you need one introduction, one conversation can change your life. We mentioned that. Secondly, nobody started a large organization. I mean, when you think about it, Apple Computer started with a guy in a garage. Hewlett and Packard were in a shed. Disney was in another shed. Everything starts at zero. I mean, Ryanair, I was looking the other day, started with one plane and 18 passengers in 1985. It flopped across to London from Waterford. So nobody started a large organization. And that was what I learned from both the Lansdowne Club and the Ireland Funds and now the Networking Institute. So these were sorts of, unwritten rules about business, if you like. I became a big fan of the concept of marginal gains, how just being a little bit better in lots of things often doesn't get you a little bit more. It often gets you everything. And being a little bit worse often gets you not a little bit less, but often gets you nothing. So that notion of kind of there's marginal pushing yourself over little small things, all coming together, have major, massive impacts. So I guess, long-winded answer, those were the sorts of things that led me down the path that actually, you can't survive and thrive without a strong and diverse network. And I was big into that word diverse because we all have a tendency to hang around with people who are just like us, I mean, there's a fancy Greek word called homophily. And homophily is this notion of birds of a feather flock together stuff. And we all have that tendency. I have that tendency. But when you're pushed outside your comfort zone, you got to actually seek out people who, what I call, are unlike-minded people. Look for difference, look for diversity. And that, I think, is increasingly important now, and certainly was in my early days.
Kingsley, if I could jump in, we mentioned that I've been very involved with a networking group here in New York, the Irish Business Organization of New York, celebrating its 50th anniversary this year. Started
Bravo.
With a couple of folks meeting at a bar once in a while, kept moving along. And what I really valued there was the idea that I was meeting people not like me. Normally I would be networking. When I did network, it was with other people in media, related industries to what I was working in. But when I went to the IBO, I met contractors, I met accountants, I met plumbers, I met salespeople. I also engaged with a lot of people who were not on the same page with me politically, but that was not part of the dialogue in the Irish Business Organization. So I really found that diversity of network was crucial.
And when jumping a little bit, but what I noticed about going to live in the US and particularly I lived in Boston, but I've spent a lot of time in New York, is that kind of nobody's from New York. Everybody comes to New York and they need to build networks just to get by. And, that's why nonprofit organizations become so important, because you can join a nonprofit organization and you might be sitting beside a head of an advertising agency, an accounting company, a manufacturing company, somebody in life insurance. So you can build a network through these sorts of opportunities. And I watched that in action, and I watched how that resulted in lots of people doing business. And I'm a big believer in, it's a bit kind of radical thought, but I'm a big believer in that, in the great race of life, always back self-interest, because at least it'll be trying. In other words, if you can find something that benefits other people, because the essence of networking is actually giving to others, not taking from them. And one of the reasons networking has got such a negative image, I mean, it conjures up, images of sleazy, slimy people late at night flicking out business cards in a bar. You wake up in the morning, you find John Lee's business card that turn up your trousers. Where did that come from? What happened last night? So, I do think that, that's such an important thing, is when you think in terms of what can I give to other people? Because it's based on a simple premise, networking. The more you give to people on an individual basis, the more it'll come back to you from the network. So it's nearly like, I think philosophy is too grand a word, but it's kind of a way of living and an approach to life. And if you just do that, just find ways to help other people, it comes back.
Just a question. I'm curious, having grown up in Dublin in the 70s and 80s, the notion of networking was kind of alien.
Yeah.
And as you've already pointed out, networking is more about giving and receiving. But traditionally, I think people of, at least of my generation in Ireland, would have been very leery of networking, seeing it primarily as self-advocacy.
Yeah.
I'm just curious now because, you spend more time in Ireland, obviously, than I do. You're based there now.
Yeah.
How has that shifted? Do you see changes amongst the younger generation versus, a grey head like mine?
Well, you're lucky. You got some. So you got a better color than mine, mate. But so I'm similar. I grew up in the 70s and 80s. One in 10 people in Ireland went to university then. Now it's 9 out of 10. They go to third level institutions. So I think there's been such a radical overhaul and shift and change that what was seen as kind of an elitist activity, that your parents were the members of Portmarnock Golf Club and Royal Dublin and the Fitzwilliam Club and the Kildare Street Club, all that stuff. I honestly think that's just, it's a hangover from very old days. We're in a completely different and a much more meritocratic age. Sure, people do leverage off a certain amount of privilege and position, but I do think that the opportunities now are phenomenal. The shifts and changes have been phenomenal. One of the things is, like when I was growing up, there wasn't a single woman president of an Irish university. There's now 8, So this country has changed quite dramatically and radically. And I touched on earlier just this, 14% of the United States were not born in the United States. In Ireland, it's 19%. So we're an incredibly diverse society now. And of course, in networking, the next question is, well, does your network reflect the diversity of the economy you work in, the society you live in? And, for most people, the answer is probably no. So there's a challenge for all of us.
Indeed. Kingsley, we want to keep moving into this discussion of networking and diaspora, but I do want to make sure we cover the chapter called the Ireland Funds. That fits very well. I think, I imagine you were working to establish a sense of community over people who had no sense of community. Sometimes I would think that this would be a task like herding kittens to get everyone on the same page and all the very, very disparate sort of Irish communities that you come across. But, take us from where you entered the scene to some of the things that the Ireland Funds accomplished over the years.
Look, I think the driver in the early days was the conflict in Northern Ireland. And I think that's what... with Dan Rooney on the owner of the Pittsburgh Steelers and Tony, both Pittsburgh people, they had this notion. Well, they had Tony is very articulate. And he said, there is such a thing as an Irish empire, not built by military might or force of arms, but just by the fact that in history, 10 million people have left this island. I mean, that's a phenomenal statistic. And as a result, they've created an empire, but not through invasion or bloody means or anything, but just by the fact that they went and they started at the bottom in many of these societies and worked their way up. I said the other day that there was a time when the Prime Minister of Australia was called Keating, the Prime Minister of New Zealand was called Muldoon, the Prime Minister of Britain was called Callaghan, the Prime Minister of Canada was Mulroney, and the President of the United States was Reagan. That is awesome, global tribe at work. So I think their sense back then was that there was a difference between the state and the nation, the state being kind of lines on a map. And we have this small little island off the edge of Europe. But we have this nation, which is kind of one of the great global tribes in history. I think that's very, and so Tony had an expression. He said, will people respond to what he called the distant drum, the ancestral echo of a land far away? And the model, interesting enough, was actually the UJA in the US, the United Jewish Appeal. What Jewish people in the United States did for their country of origin or ancestry or affinity in Israel was nothing short of extraordinary. But we hadn't done that. And that was what O'Reilly and Rooney were kind of thinking of. And we, it's apocryphal, the story, but we had a first dinner in New York in 1985 to launch this, in the Waldorf Astoria, the great and the good and all that stuff. It was such a disaster. The only reason we had a second dinner a year later was to pay for the first dinner we had. And that's like $700 million ago. So back to my thing, nobody starts a large organization. And it was extraordinary in those days the sorts of people who got involved and responded to this. And that was the vision. I always think that for these sorts of organizations, you need three things to succeed. You need a great case powerfully articulated. So the why should people support you? And there was the conflict in Northern Ireland with a very clear why. Secondly, you need a constituency of people. You got to know, who are these people? Where are they? What are they doing? There was a very obvious constituency in the United States, particularly New York, particularly Wall Street. You think back to the Dan Tullys, you think back to the Don Keoghs, you think back to, the guys in Budweiser, Mike Rorty, you think of all those amazing names. And then the third thing you need to be successful, and I actually think this is the most successful of the three, you need leadership. And O'Reilly and Rooney, they had moral authority, they had leadership capacity and ability, they had clout, they had money, they had lots of things that all came together, which got this organization going. But, as always, it's a slog. And it was a question of just, one step forward all the time. And then building a network, sometimes described as a network of A&I, affluence and influence, trying to appeal to the right people who had the capacity to do things. And it just grew from there. And then we took it to a whole load of other countries.
Kingsley, you mentioned the United Jewish Appeal. My wife is Jewish. Mm-hmm. And so I'm somewhat familiar with that. Mm-hmm. What does that particular organization and maybe the whole Jewish diaspora do better? Are they the primary model that everybody looks to in terms of success in diaspora matters? Well,
of course, historically, and, the great diasporas of the world are victim diasporas. And there is no greater victim diaspora than the Jewish diaspora because of the Holocaust. But then you have the Armenians with the genocide. You have the Irish with the famine. I mean, they are the great sort of diasporas of the world. But things evolve and things change. So I think the most exciting diaspora in the world today is actually the Indian diaspora. And they, 25 years ago, were a basket case. They were a shambles. The Indian diaspora had no time or respect for India and vice versa. But in about 2002, the Prime Minister of India, Manmohan Singh, the Minister of Foreign Affairs, established a commission, a high-level commission of the Indian diaspora. They spent 2 years speaking to Indians all around the world. And they wrote a report. You can read it. It's 700 pages. It's online. And they made certain recommendations in the report, such as they introduced a new type of passport, the OCI, the Overseas Citizen of India. They started a conference in every January in India for 3,000 Indian CEOs from around the world who went back. They started a Young India program, a No India program. They changed the law in terms of ownership of property, investing in shares. They did lots of things. They've created this concept of global Indianness now. I mean, Indians, they run some of the great companies of the world, but also there's millions of Indians running small enterprises around the world. And India's done a pretty good job of this. So I do a lot of work with other countries. I was in Nigeria just a few weeks ago, and I was basically saying to the Nigerians, you could be the Indians of the future, but it's going to take you 20, 25 years. But you have lots of smart Nigerians around the world, highly educated in positions, and they're going to move up through that. So, long-winded answer, just I think there's we've a lot to learn from each other, from other countries, and other countries have a lot to learn from us.
Kingsley, we've had some Indian connections here on Irish Stew. We had a novelist from India, Goveri Madhavan, who moved to Ireland and it's written an interesting novel with a lot of making a lot of Irish Indian connections, which we had a good time exploring. And Martin and I are both members of a Twitter group, an Irish Twitter group run by a gentleman named Sri Srinivasan,
all right,
who I hope you meet sometime if you haven't met him already. And
is he the Srinivasans of Kerry or the Srinivasans of Kerry?
There was a New York City councilman named John Liu, a Chinese American, and of course in New York you have to appeal to the Irish audience as well. So he described himself as being from County Taiwan.
I love it. Yeah. Well, the fastest Irish man in the world today, the fastest Irish woman in the world today, are actually, born. They're born in Ireland, totally Irish, but they're Nigerian of origin and ancestry. And what they're doing now and what they may well do in the Paris Olympics is going to be nothing short of remarkable.
Yeah, I've been following the career of Rashida Adeleke quite closely. That's actually what brought me to America.
Oh, you were a runner?
Athlete. I came here on athletic scholarship, so
Villanova?
I've maintained my touch and connections actually through that particular network.
And was it Villanova, Martin?
No, I came to St. John's in Queens,
okay.
But I'm a member of what we call the Irish Pipeline, which apparently something like 700 to 800 Irish people came through American colleges, specifically in the sport of athletics or track and field, as it's called here in the United States. But enough about me. I just want to kind of switch back towards the Irish American diaspora, because one of the things that I've come across in my conversations is a concern of the aging out, if you will, of that diaspora. So when you think about it, the big flood of Irish immigrants into America takes place really in the 19th century. It's a massive flood of people. Now, it continues to the 1950s, but we do have people here that are 5 or 6 generations removed from their ancestral Irish immigrants. How much of a barrier is that in terms of diaspora policy from an Irish point of view? How do you keep that connection close? And should the effort be made specifically to address that?
Well, your stats are fascinating. There are 140,000 about Irish-born people live in the United States. Right? It's tiny. It's absolutely tiny. It's full of a football stadium and a little bit more. That's all. And yet people say there's 40 million Irish Americans, and they're not Irish, they're Irish Americans. And Irish Americans are a different tribe from Irish-born people. And I think we often don't make that distinction here. We kind of think they're all the same. And look, last weekend, those 40,000 people over from Notre Dame, it was quite extraordinary. So I do think they're slightly different families in a way, but they're all part of the same tribe. And I think that it's important that we recognize that they've got differences, that essentially they are American, these 40 million people who have got an Irish dimension. But I think we're moving into a world, I think the United States is moving into be more a mosaic than a melting pot. And it was always traditionally was a melting pot. You dropped all your background. But I think now you can have a hyphenated life. You can be American and Greek, American and Polish, American and Irish. And technology and communications are making all of this very, very possible. So I think that's a resource and that's a power, but it is a different one and often requires different policies and projects, if you like, to engage with them. But I don't necessarily buy into the notion that just because it's 3 or 4 generations removed, it's going to die. I think it's different, but it's not going to die. I mean, Dan Rooney, it'll be his grandparents and great-grandparents, and yet he was passionately engaged and involved. But I do think we got to understand that there's no such thing really as a diaspora. There's many diasporas, and they're very different and diverse and diffuse and sometimes disputatious. And you touched on that, John, at the very beginning. And, I thought it was just the Irish. They all do it. The Scottish diaspora all dispute and fight. The Haitians, the Nigerians. It's nothing to do with the nationality. It's to do with human nature. And that's the way kind of things are. So I don't despair in a way of saying that, there's now, it's all gone, it's all dead, it's all over. I just think it's different. And I think the plus thing is that technology communications are making it so possible to be here and there, to live with 1 foot in one place, 1 foot in another place. And I think maybe for the first time we can say, geography is history, in that in the old days, your geography dictated your identity. If you lived in Southern California, that's who you were, But now you can live in Southern California, be very loyal to everything there, but also be very engaged back in Ireland or Scotland or Poland. And I think that's an interesting dynamic. And I'm seeing that because now I work with lots of other countries. And I'm seeing this being played out in so many different ways.
So the follow-up question that I have to that, you kind of refer to the power of tech in terms of, essentially overcoming geographical boundaries. But talk to me about the virtue of tech versus meeting in the round, so to speak, in other words, in reality, because it seems to me in a lot of cases that people have become more isolated because of tech than more connected.
Look, I completely agree. I think technology was basically designed to bring us all together, as having exactly the opposite effect. I think the greatest crisis in the world today, along with maybe climate change and Ukraine, etc., but I think the great crisis of the world today is loneliness and isolation. And the Harvard longitudinal study basically said that loneliness is the longest study ever of aging. Loneliness and isolation are more damaging to your health than alcohol, than drugs, than the load of other things. So I think that's the crisis, a fundamental crisis of our times. And it's a particular crisis amongst the next generation coming through. And I see it in my networking training with corporates, where they'll say to me, the CEOs of the corporates would say to me things like, the kids coming in today are fantastic. They're brilliant, deductive, and analytic, and completely crap at all the soft skills. They will talk electronically, but they won't speak person to person. So my slight concern and fear in all of this huge shift to technology is that, yes, and I buy into it and I accept it, and I think AI will do lots of amazing things. We have to be high tech, but we have to be high touch. And my concern is that we're veering towards the high tech nearly exclusively. So I think that that's a particular challenge for us. But I do think, and I back to 40,000 people coming to Dublin last weekend from Notre Dame. Why do they do that? I think obviously they're loyal to their own team, etc., but they have a sense of belonging. And I do think that that's a very powerful motivator. And I think when you look at you, Martin and John, what you're doing it, I think, out of a certain sense of belonging to a tribe, across the water. And I think we don't recognize and accept enough that we all have a desire to belong. And when it comes to diaspora, very often that belonging is not to a country, but to a place. So not only is somebody very passionate about Donegal, they rather hope Cork falls over, So good old begrudgery. Good old begrudgery comes in, or sometimes it's not Donegal, maybe sometimes it's Letterkenny or a little part of it. And I was just in Mostar a few weeks ago, working with the USAID project actually in Bosnia, and it was fascinating to see that it was about Mostar. The people wanted to support Mostar because that's where their parents or grandparents were from, and they'd no interest in Sarajevo. They wanted to go to Mostar, and I see that played out in lots of countries now. It's about place, not country.
And that kind of leads us into a discussion about, in my view, the gathering, because that seemed to be an example to me of micro diaspora outreach. I think the gathering took place about 10 years ago.
Yeah.
So talk to us a little bit about that and that particular success. And with every success, there are sometimes failures and difficulties and criticisms. So tell me a bit about that.
So the gathering was based on something that Scotland did years prior to that in 2009 called the homecoming. So Scotland came up with this idea. The Scottish diaspora is a lot to do with clans, and so they did this homecoming where they appealed to the McTavishes and the McGregors and the McDonalds in different countries around the world, all come back and have clan gatherings, but all at one time. And I wrote a report on that actually for the government here. And eventually, Ireland decided on doing the gathering. And I have to say, John, I'm a founder member of an organization called CASE, and CASE stands for Copy and Steal Everything. Just go figure, who does something really well. So we copied the Jewish struggle with the situation that they put together, and lots of countries copy what we do, and we copied Scotland in this. And now loads of countries are doing gatherings and homecomings, etc. Kenya has done one, and lots of countries are doing that. And it is back to that sense of belonging, B, sense of place, as you say, and they're all like little mini micro diaspora initiatives. Which are springing up all over the place. In fact, I'm going to do something in Sligo in a couple of weeks. It's an initiative called Turris. We have the Global Limerick Network. We have the Donegal, Tip O'Neill initiatives up there. We're seeing a lot of that happening. I did work a couple of years ago for the city of Copenhagen. They have a thing called Copenhagen Global Ambassadors all around the world, who support Copenhagen for trade, investment, tourism, sport, culture, arts, all that kind of stuff. Because I think we do have that desire to belong specifically to a place, and it's very powerful.
Kingsley, at the top of the show, I described you as a thought leader in diaspora engagement. It's good to have those thoughts, but you need to get those thoughts out to the world. And I've noticed you're very effective in the way you describe what you're trying to do and what other people are trying to do in this area and package your ideas in a very memorable way. So perhaps you could give us a little more background on the term you use, diaspora capital.
Yeah, so I think every country possesses diaspora capital, which is made up of three flows. Flows of people, flows of knowledge, and flows of money. And every country has it in varying degrees, and every place has it in varying degrees. And it's not just places, organizations have it. For example, universities. I mean, back to the case theory, the American University Alumni Network, and you must know it, Martin, from St. John's and from Villanova and these other things. It's a powerful thing. And Notre Dame was an example of that last weekend. But that's the same principles that you can apply to countries or places for diasporas. The same as the university alumni model. And the university alumni model is engaging with as many people as possible in the university alumni network, but also taking out your rifle and having some very specific conversations with people who have the capacity and the propensity, to do something major for the university. So we sometimes say, it's about, you're mining for coal and you're mining for diamonds. And that's the same, really, in a way, for diaspora engagement. You want to engage lots and lots of people, but you also want to get, a few number of people. So you've probably heard of Chuck Feeney, who, he's probably put about 2 billion into projects in Ireland, probably 1 billion into universities in Ireland. We would not be where we are today as a country were it not for Chuck Feeney, one man, one guy, who by chance bumped into Ed Walsh, the president of Limerick University, on a flight and started having a chat. And the rest, as they say, is history. So countries have to find their Chuck Feeneys, but they also have to find all the other people and the next generation and the gender initiatives, all that other stuff, that kind of mosaic of activities to make things happen. And the reason I'm kind of intrigued by it now is that I think, and this would be my kind of, what's the thing, the initiative you have at the end of the show?
Shameless plug.
Yeah, the shameless plug would be, I think we're sitting on a very interesting potential initiative for Ireland, which is to become the world leader in diaspora engagement. And the world, I believe, will beat a path to our door if we do that. So I've developed a lot of online training. One of them is in diaspora engagement. And I now have 400 people in about 3 or 4 weeks in Kosovo starting this program. So their entire diplomatic corps is going to go on this online training program because we have something special to offer. And with Peter Ryan, I went to Nigeria a few weeks ago, and then before that, I was a week in Zambia. And in each of those countries, the leadership of the countries, so many of them said to me, I was taught by an Irish priest. I was taught by an Irish nun. So historically, we have this amazing connection with Africa, which is not a colonial relationship. It is a relationship of help and affinity with these places. Now, we don't have any more priests and nuns going out to do that work in Africa. I believe the next iteration of that interaction with Africa is for us to help African countries connect with their diasporas. And that's where we could offer something really amazing to the world. That, I wrote these reports on Zambia and Nigeria just last week and sent them off. But they both said to me, no country's ever offered this to us. No country's ever said to us, we want to help you. Now, it's part of Ireland's national diaspora policy. It's in our policy to position Ireland as a world leader and to share what we've learned with other countries. And there's over 100 countries now trying to figure out how do they engage with their diasporas. So I think this would be my kind of my shameless moment would be, we have an opportunity here to really go for this.
Kingsley, one thing you said about the diaspora, as you might think, well, why should we spread this good thing to other countries? Why not keep it ourselves? Yeah. But you had that expression. I really thought about it a lot about the diaspora business is non-competitive.
Yes. I mean, somebody's going to help Poland, Peru, or Portugal is not going to help Switzerland or Swaziland. So we should share. we have something great to share. We should be open to everybody. And it's incredible. I mean, I spoke to ministers, I talked to the prime minister of these countries who said, we now have, through this device, if you like, we have access to the leadership of these countries. We're going to spend billions in Africa on aid in the next few years out of Ireland. I mean, it's wonderful what we do. But up till now, we haven't spent a penny doing this. And I think this would be a brilliant thing to do.
So speaking of ministers and government, if you were to wave your magic wand and say, hey, I'd like to pass these 3 pieces of legislation, which I believe would enhance diaspora policy, outreach, etc., by Ireland, what would that look like?
So I think, we have a thing called the Emigrant Support Program out of the Department of Foreign Affairs, which is about, I think I might be right in saying, is 10, 11, 12 million a year. What if that was 50 million a year? What if that was 100 million a year? What if we really, I mean, 10 million is great, but it's small beer, given that we have a budget surplus of 64 billion looming, So imagine if we really engaged. And, when we talk about diaspora capital, there's all sorts of initiatives in art, in education, in training, obviously inward investment and commerce and trade and all that kind of stuff. So I think that if I had a magic wand, I'd be upping that very, very significantly. I think there's a tricky one on the whole area of voting rights, and I think that's a bit of a poison chalice that I think governments are generally trying to avoid, taking this one on because they're not sure what the reaction will be. But I think there's certainly a need to have some form of representation. I'm not quite sure what shape that takes. France, for example, a lot of countries have it. France has a national assembly of people from overseas. I think possibly for us, a few members in the Senate and the Dáil would be a good idea. People are nervous here that the sheer numbers might swamp, the local vote, etc. I don't think that would happen, but so that would be a second thing. Would be some sort of representation, and thirdly, maybe there are some really powerful agencies like Alliance Française, Goethe Institute from German, Cervantes Institute from Spain, the Italian Institute, etc. I think there's interesting agencies that are, if you like, using it in the best possible sense of the word, propaganda machines for the culture and art of a country. I think we could do something in that space a little bit more active, because I really think we're coming into a fascinating period now. We're now one of the wealthiest and most developed countries in the world. And Martin, when you and I were growing up in Dublin, we weren't that. We were far off that. But it's been quite remarkable, the progress that's been made.
Yeah, the Dublin I left in 1983, so it's 40 years ago this year. For me, it's extraordinary how much it's changed. But I would also kind of, just going back to your commentary on voting rights, I am an Irish citizen, and yet I've never voted in an election. And it seems that Ireland is the outlier. And anytime I've seen people kind of suggest this in the media domain, I've seen pretty virulent pushback in Ireland on social media against this. And I think the big fear is that because of the scale of the Irish diaspora, that they will swamp the domestic, interests. And that the sense is that offshore people, even if they are Irish-born like myself, should not be allowed to vote unless we are actually paying taxes. I'd be curious to kind of think, if you were to put on your planning hat and policy hat, if you actually believe it is a good idea to get some representation politically in Ireland by this massive offshore diaspora. How do you go about convincing Irish citizens that that's actually a good thing?
Yeah, look, I think that there's a big information debate has to happen. We need champions here for it. I mean, I'm in favor of it, and I think it all comes down then to the fine print. Is it for we give out a lot of passports here. So, for example, I remember asking a minister once. I said, if that cop on Fifth Avenue with red hair and freckles on St. Patrick's Day, who has never been in Ireland, and his parents have never been in Ireland, but his granny was born in Ireland. If he has a vote equal to my vote. That's kind of, I'm not sure I'm comfortable with that. And there was no real answer to that question. But the answer will be in the fine print of whatever the legislation will be, which I think will probably restrict. I mean, you would have a genuine reason and a genuine desire to have a vote, but you're Irish born and you live there and you have a passport and all the rest of it. I think it really comes down to who would be in the electorate, who would be covered by that.
Kingsley, my wife is from Italy. She's an Italian citizen, and by extension, my daughter's an Italian citizen, and both of them vote in Italian elections.
Yeah,
but I think it's the scale that's where the issue becomes very, very different.
Yeah.
I had a thought, though, while we're having this discussion, we're kind of raising a thorny point for governments with their diaspora. This voting issue, a bit of a thorny issue.
Yeah.
Are there other things about about diaspora engagement that can represent a cause for concern for the home country?
I think you mentioned at the top of the hour plastic paddies and the kind of images that are out there. Now Ireland, I think historically has always struggled a little bit and suffered a little bit from images out there about what's typically Irish. And then when people come here, they find, it's really, really quite different. So, how do you get over that? How do you portray a country as being what it is rather than being what, social media, media in general like to portray it as? So, I think you can't take out ads in the New York Times and say, we're not stupid. You can't do that kind of stuff. It's a bit like taking out an ad saying, for Aer Lingus saying at 30,000 feet, our engines don't fall off, because then the first thing people all think is, oh, Jesus, we got a problem. So I think that I think Ireland's global brand, if you like, in the world has absolutely fundamentally shifted and changed. And it can be done through lots of ways. It could be done through Riverdance or U2 or the Wall Street or, Tim O'Connor used to be, you'd know him from New York, the Consul General. He said there's two really important streets for Ireland in New York. One is Wall Street and the other is Broadway. And I think that's an interesting kind of way of looking at it. So I think now at the moment we have, and I'm a rugby fan, the Irish rugby team is number one in the world. We're going to go into the World Cup. We have Irish soccer, the Irish women's soccer team. We're down in Australia, just first time ever. I mean, there's all sorts of extraordinary things happening. We have, Nigerians running for Ireland are incredible runners. We have great hockey. We've got amazing hurling and football. I mean, there's a real depth of stuff there. But I think there's an awareness of that around the world. Whereas that kind of unidimensional, simplistic kind of view on plastic paddy stuff, and will always be there because there'll always be ignorance there. But I think we've made some strides.
I know my wife cringes when the Italian accents come out on a TV comedy and that kind of thing. She's like, oh, God.
Here we go. Pizza, Pizza was invented in New York. Yeah.
Don't tell them that.
Yeah.
So talk to us a little bit about, obviously we've talked about the Ireland funds. And as you mentioned, I think you said in the course of your tenure there, you raised $250 million which was in turn invested back into various programs and organizations during your tenure. But that draws to a close and then you shift again. Talk to me about that transition, because as I understand it, I think you were Boston based, for that period. And what is it like after, living so long offshore to come back onshore to Ireland?
Look, that's a really interesting debate and question. And first thing I would say is nobody cares. Nobody cares a hoot where you were or what you did. I found it fascinating. I was away for over 20 years. I go back, I walk down Grafton Street. Somebody says, how are you? And I said, how are you? And we walk on. And they didn't know I'd been away, right? So, not only do they not know, they have no interest. And when they do hear you've been away, you know what? They don't ask any questions. They're not curious. And, it's totally understandable. They've gone on with their life. You've pissed off and gone off and done other things, and now you're back. They're happy enough you're back, but they've no interest. So there's that. I think I think there's a fascinating dynamic going on right now of people coming back from lots of different places. I mean, our population is actually growing. I mentioned at the start, 10 million left, and always immigration was the word we associated with Ireland. People are coming back now, and they're coming back very often when at certain kind of pivotal points in their own careers, either work-wise or their families. I know we had 4 kids and we came back when they're, I'll give you a simple economic answer. We lived in Boston beside Boston College. Boston College is $75,000 a year. My kids went here to college in Dublin and they paid a couple of grand. And I'm sure Boston College is a fantastic institution, but it's not 70 times better than Trinity or UCD or any of these places. So there's that kind of dimension to it. We also had an aging parent dimension stuff to it, want to be around as they, that exit happened over a 20-year period. And also, and this sounds a bit pompous to say this, but I do have a sense of being European. And have a strong affinity here. I've just come back from doing a month's intensive course, French course in the south of France, and because I'm always embarrassed wherever I go in the world, and I present all over different countries that are not native English speakers. I always present in English, and their English is fantastic. I just think that that's a shame. That so now I've set myself the goal. I always have a bucket list every year, and the bucket list this year is to be able to present in French. So I've made some efforts in that area. But I do think, people are over and back like never before. They live those hyphenated lives. They might live somewhere but have an interest here. They might even have, if they can afford it, have a property here, etc. So I think that's a different dynamic that's going on now.
But when you moved back to Ireland, you could have just kind of faded in and just said, here I'm hanging up my clogs. I'm going to play golf. But you chose not to do that. So talk to me about your continuation of work.
Well, because I'm not very good at golf, essentially, was a reason for that. But no, I mean, I'm a big believer in the thing called the third act, and I'm in my third act. And in my third act, my first act was growing up in family school and education, all that kind of stuff. Second act was a big chunk of a career. But then third act, like 50% of the people in Ireland who reach 60 will now reach 90. So we now have a whole longevity issue, a whole period in our lives that most people don't prepare themselves very well for, particularly, in a corporate world, they're working for a bank or something, and, around 60, 65, they get shunted out. And they could well live 30 more years, and they've never really thought about it. And the companies don't care. They want them out. And so, and I saw it actually, I saw it in the US down in Florida. There's a number of sort of high-flying executives are going to retire down to Florida. They drink too much gin and tonic and play too much golf. And, they actually, a lot of them just slipped away because they lacked purpose. It seems to me, so the third act is all about having a new purpose in life. I also got married late, so I still have kids who are kind of hanging around a bit, so they're in their 20s. But for me, there was just this a wonderful opportunity. I'm a great believer. I call it send the elevator back down. I mean, a lot of people helped me along the way, and they were fantastic to me. And I can't help them, either they're not around or whatever, but I can pass it on. So I do lots of stuff in schools and lots of stuff in colleges and lots of stuff basically saying, look, I want to share with you the stuff that I've been engaged in and why I think this stuff's important. And the funny thing about the networking space is no school or college teaches networking. And it's one of the unwritten rules of life and of business is that, having relationships with people is going to make a huge difference. But you don't get taught that. Progress in school or college is about getting a grade, a score, a mark, a metric. Then you get into the real world of work. And there's a whole series of things that count, but can't be counted. Empathy, determination, grit, resilience, attitude, humor, crack, as we say over here. All of these things matter a lot. And they've got nothing to do with this, they got everything to do with the person around you. Whereas in school, it's got nothing to do with the person sitting beside you. So I think that's, that whole area of soft skills is a thing that, you listen to, you listen to Deloitte, McKinsey, the World Economic Forum, they all are saying the same thing. Soft skills are going to become more important in the future with the advent of AI and robotics and automation. And yet we're not preparing our people for this.
Seems like such a basic skill, and I had none of it, and I was pretty terrible at it.
Yeah.
But a dozen or so years ago, I kind of needed to do it, and I learned it, and I like it. It's a skill you can acquire, and that whole thing exactly. People helped me, and I can't help them back at this point, but I can help the next person.
You can do that, yeah.
And you never know, that person may then have something good for me too. So it's a whole different world.
Yeah.
Kingsley, we think big here on Irish Stew. We talk about the global Irish nation, but I came across something you said that's even bigger than the nation, the diaspora galaxy.
Yeah.
What do you mean by that?
I was trying to say, I think I had this notion of the diaspora like a galaxy, and there's all these sort of twinkling stars, in the galaxy, and there's a sun and there's a moon, and where do you fit in this, and what can you do? I mean, think about this statistic. In 1990, there were 150 million people living outside the country they were born in. Now it's 280 million. I mean, migration has been the phenomenon of our times. And in fact, sadly, migrant is probably one of the most negative words in the English language. I mean, you think about the issues on the Mexican border, you think about the hundreds and hundreds drowning in the Mediterranean or crossing the English Channel. Migration is absolutely a toxic word. But diaspora is not. And when you start, and they're the same thing, one causes the other. And you start looking at the statistics in the United States for the number of companies founded by migrants or the sons and daughters of migrants is just extraordinary. I mean, back to my story about the Indian. I mean, the Indians are highly educated people, certainly the ones who go to the United States. And what they're creating and the value add that they're doing and what they're contributing is just phenomenal. And yet we have to push back against all these kind of right-wing kind of anti-migrant movements, foreigner stuff, etc. And to a certain extent, when people come over here to Ireland and they go into a pub and there's a lovely Polish girl serving them a pint of Guinness, they say, "Oh God, I wish it was an Irish girl," So, I just think, much as I love Ireland and Irish, etc., we're human beings. We're part of the human race. The problems we have now are not national problems; they're global issues. So we got to figure out ways to deal with them, interacting with all of us.
And so, with all the in-depth and profound ideas we've been kicking around, unfortunately, we have to draw to a close. So this is the opportunity maybe to reiterate your shameless plug, or if you have another one that you would like to plug. You are actually allowed more than one, Kingsley.
Right. Yeah.
Lights, action, camera, go.
Oh, listen, I'm not a great salesperson for sure, but we want to scale what we do, and we can't do it on our own. And that's why we've developed online courses. So you can go on our website and you can have a look at training courses. So we genuinely want to do that. But I'll go back to the preliminary shameless. I do want to try and position Ireland as an absolute center of excellence in this space of diaspora engagement, so that countries will come to Ireland. Like there was discussion with the Zambians about a study tour to bring their foreign affairs people down, spend a week here, just talking to, watching, listening, learning from what we've been doing over the years. I think we could become an absolute epicenter for this subject around the world. It's only going to grow dramatically. Technology is going to help it enormously. No other country is positioned themselves as kind of a thought leader in this space. We're willing to share this stuff. It's part of our national policy. It ties in with this post-priests and nuns situation in Africa, etc. So to me, I think it's an opportunity hidden in plain sight, and we need to grab it.
Well, Kingsley, we thank you so much. We didn't realize it until we started getting engaged with you that we're kind of acolytes of the path that you've been forging. And please keep us in your diaspora galaxy. Let us know how we can help make it all shine. And we'll follow your dictum, go forth and diasporize.
Oh, I love it. Thank you, guys. Really enjoyed that. Take care.
Great episode, John, with Kingsley. And one of the things that struck me and surprised me in our conversation was this notion of taking diaspora skills global. And it struck me also that he is at a point in his life where he's really understood that it is important to help others, and that has the often serendipitous quality of boomeranging back and helping the helper. It's certainly a viewpoint that I've adopted in my life, and I think we'd all be well served by that generosity of spirit and seeking to help, certainly in a fraught global situation at the moment that people need to check themselves and realize that they're better off helping each other than trying to kill each other.
I love this observation. We've been involved with the diaspora world for the last few years here on Irish Stew, but I love this observation. It never struck me before that diaspora engagement was a non-competitive business. And I love that thought. And I love the idea of Ireland being the spokesperson for that globally. And I appreciate his comments about the high touch and soft power. In my world, in the business context, too often, if it's not in the data, it doesn't exist. And of course it does. I love the way he was saying that the soft power would be the power of the future.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of stuff that doesn't easily fall into the data capture world. And certainly that's a world that I live in. These kind of skills, the skills that make a diaspora work well, are the same skills that make people able to network effectively. And as Kingsley remarked, it's extraordinarily important for individuals when they build a career to have those kind of skills. And yet, no academic institution makes that part of one's education. We're fortunate that Kingsley obviously has a company that is basically encouraging people to learn these kind of skills. And we encourage you to engage with that. And we will obviously leave links in the show notes. So with that, we're looking forward to doing another episode. And for now, we're going to sign off. Irish Stew is produced by John Lee, Martin Nutty, and Bill Schultz. Editing, mixing, and mastering by Bill Schultz. Music on Irish Stew was composed and performed by Rosa Nutty, with Donald Bowens on drums, Cathal O'Riordan on bass and synthesizer. For more on Rosa Nutty's music, please visit rosanutty.com.